On November 6, 1984, the syrup supplied to Coca-Cola bottlers changed. No one announced it with the new bottle shape. There was no warning label, no public ceremony, and no customer vote. A later federal court record preserves the transition in unusually plain language. In January 1980, the syrup was listed as 50% high-fructose corn syrup, known as HFCS 55. By February 1984, it was 75%. On November 6th, it became 100% HFCS 55. The date matters because it makes an enormous shift feel almost mundane. America did not wake up one morning and decide that corn should replace sugar in its drinks. The decision had been made gradually in laboratories, processing plants, farm policy offices, purchasing departments, and contracts between companies. By the time the formula changed, the system that made the change attractive had been under construction for years, and that is the dark history of corn syrup. Not a secret plot, not a story in which one ingredient suddenly poisons a nation. The darker story is more ordinary, and therefore more unsettling. A familiar sweetener became cheap, flexible, and everywhere because technology, government policy, and corporate food production moved in the same direction. The ingredient in question was not even ordinary corn syrup. It was high-fructose corn syrup, a product made by taking cornstarch, breaking it down into glucose, and then using enzymes to convert some of that glucose into fructose. The result could be tuned for different uses. HFCS 42 became common in many processed foods. HFCS 55 became especially useful in soft drinks. For consumers, it was nearly invisible. For the food system, it was a solution. The question is, a solution to what? Start with the name, because it hides the first trick. Corn syrup and high-fructose corn syrup are related, but they are not the same thing. Corn syrup begins with cornstarch. Processing breaks that starch into smaller sugars, primarily glucose. High-fructose corn syrup takes the next step. Some of the glucose is converted into fructose. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration describes common commercial forms as HFCS 42 and HFCS 55, names that refer to their fructose content. That detail sounds technical, but it explains why the ingredient mattered. A food company does not buy sweetness as an abstract idea. It buys a material that must dissolve, mix, pour, survive transport, behave predictably on a production line, and create the same taste in millions of packages. A sweetener that works in a sauce may not be the right sweetener for a beverage. A sweetener that is easy to store may not be the cheapest one to use at industrial scale. For centuries, sugar made from cane or beets had done much of that work. It was familiar, it carried social meaning. It was sold in crystals and measured in spoonfuls, so it looked like a simple household product. But sugar was never only a household product. It was also an agricultural market, an import market, a processing market, and a political market. Its price did not emerge only from what a shopper was willing to pay. It was shaped by rules protecting domestic producers, by limits on imports, and by the relationship between growers, refiners, manufacturers, and government. That matters because the story of HFCS is often told backward. People see a cheap sweetener in a soda or packaged food and assume that corn was simply abundant. So food companies naturally used it. Corn was abundant, but abundance alone does not turn a crop into a standardized liquid ingredient that can compete with sugar. The crop needed a process, the process needed investment, and the investment needed a reason. The darkness here is not that shoppers were unable to pronounce an ingredient, it is that the most important choices were made far away from the shelf. The public could see the finished soda, it could not see the engineering decisions behind the syrup, the agricultural rules affecting rival sweeteners, or the calculations that made a reformulated product look like business as usual. In the supermarket, All of that complexity collapsed into one line of small print: high-fructose corn syrup. The phrase would later become a symbol of processed food, industrial agriculture, and public health anxiety. But before it became a villain, it was a technical challenge. Its makers were trying to solve a much narrower problem: how to turn a starch-rich crop into a sweetener industry could use at scale. That required one of the most consequential quiet tools in modern food production: an enzyme. An enzyme is easy to overlook because it does not look like a factory, a farm, or a law. Yet an enzyme can change what a factory is able to make. In the case of HFCS, the key tool was glucose isomerase. Scientific literature on the enzyme identifies the production of high-fructose corn syrup as its major food industry use. Its job was to convert glucose into fructose. That conversion did not merely make corn syrup more interesting in a laboratory. It created a route to a product that food manufacturers could use in more places. The first U.S. introduction of HFCS came in 1967. But introduction is not the same as domination. A technology can exist for years without moving the market. It must become reliable, cheap enough, and easy enough to fit existing plants. It must arrive when buyers have a reason to change their habits. According to a U.S. Department of Agriculture analysis, commercial use did not grow significantly until a 1972 breakthrough made a continuous low-cost enzyme process possible. This is one of the turning points that disappears when the story is reduced to a single ingredient on a label. Before continuous processing, a clever chemical or biological conversion could remain a specialist technique. Continuous processing changes the arithmetic. Instead of treating every batch as an event, a plant can make the conversion part of an ongoing industrial flow. The machinery, the enzyme system, the inputs, and the output begin to operate as a repeatable chain. The product could now be supplied as industry wanted it supplied. Consistently, then came a version especially suited to beverages. The USDA reported that HFCS 55 was commercially introduced in 1977 and rapidly displaced liquid sugar in beverage uses. The number 55 did not make a dramatic advertisement, but it answered a practical question for manufacturers. It gave them a form of the new sweetener that fit a high-volume drink business. It is tempting to imagine the moment as a scientific triumph, followed automatically by consumer benefit. That is not how systems work. Technology opens a door. It does not decide who walks through it, how quickly, or what gets left behind. For food companies, the new ingredient offered flexibility. The USDA described HFCS as spreading rapidly because it could technically substitute for sugar in key uses, and because it could be produced at a lower cost. In the Midwest during the 1980s, HFCS prices were reported at discounts of roughly 10 to 30% below refined sugar. That is the language of a purchasing department, not a conspiracy. A manufacturer compares ingredients. It compares supply, price, handling, and performance. If a liquid sweetener can arrive in bulk, enter a production line efficiently, and cost less than its established rival, changing the formula can look less like a historic decision than an obvious one. But obvious is a dangerous word. It often means that the structure behind a choice has become invisible. Why was refined sugar the expensive rival? Why did the comparison favor HFCS in the first place? The answer was not contained inside a corn kernel or an enzyme tank. It was also written into the rules of the American sugar market. There is a version of this story in which HFCS wins a fair contest because it is simply better. There is another version in which a single government policy creates the whole industry. Both are too simple. The real history is darker because it is a system story. An industrial technology met a protected market. Each made the other more valuable. The United States has long operated sugar policy through mechanisms that affect domestic supply and price. The USDA describes the modern framework as beginning in 1981. Its tools include marketing allotments, tariff rate quotas, high tariffs, and price support arrangements. Together, these measures restrict imports and support domestic sugar prices above comparable world prices. To a cane grower, beet grower, refiner, or lawmaker, those rules are not necessarily described as a sugar wall. They are usually defended in the language of stability, farmer income, domestic production, and protection from volatile world markets. Policy is almost never written as a cartoon villainy. It is written in technical terms, divided among agencies, programs, quotas, and price mechanisms. But food manufacturers read the result in a simpler language: cost. When a company considers switching from refined sugar to a corn-based liquid sweetener, it does not need to prove that sugar is bad. It only needs to see that another ingredient can do the job for less. The protected sugar market did not invent glucose isomerase. Glucose isomerase did not write the sugar program. Yet together they created an environment in which HFCS had a powerful commercial opening. The USDA's 1990 analysis described the American sweetener market as transformed by the Sugar Support Program and the rapid adoption of HFCS. That phrasing is important. The story is not corn defeated sugar. It is policy and processing remade the choices available to industry. In 1977, domestic refined sugar deliveries reached a peak of 10.4 million tons. During the following decade, they declined as HFCS displaced sugar in liquid industrial uses, especially beverages. This was not a tiny substitution at the edge of the market. It happened in the part of the food economy that could change millions of servings with a single procurement decision. The contrast between the two sweeteners was not visible in a kitchen. It was visible in the infrastructure around them. Sugar was tied to growers, import arrangements, refiners, and federal programs. HFCs was tied to corn processing, enzyme technology, dedicated production capacity, and buyers able to reformulate at scale. One system had political protection. The other developed a technical route around the protected price. That is what makes the history uncomfortable. Market choices are often presented as if they were personal choices multiplied by millions. But the crucial choices here were institutional. A shopper could choose among brands. The brand had already chosen which sweetener to buy. Its purchasing team had already received the price signals, and public policy had partly created those signals. The result was not a hidden room in which someone decided what America should drink. It was more durable than that. It was a chain of incentives. Farmers, processors, manufacturers, and policymakers did not have to agree on a grand plan. They only had to respond to the rules and opportunities in front of them. When enough institutions respond in the same direction, the result can look inevitable. It was not inevitable. It was engineered. By 1986, corn sweetener consumption in the United States had reached 8.146 million tons on a dry basis, according to the USDA. It had surpassed sugar. Between 1979 and 1985, HFCS use rose by about 600,000 tons per year, nearly 5 pounds per person each year. Numbers that large are difficult to picture, so return to the Coca-Cola bottler record. January 1980, 50% HFCS 55. February 1984, 75%. November 1984, 100%. Those steps did not mean every bottle in America changed in one instant. The court record concerns the syrup supplied in the bottling relationship at issue, but it captures the wider pattern perfectly. The old ingredient did not vanish through a public argument. It was blended down, phased out, and replaced inside supply chains. The consumer saw a familiar brand. The system saw a better deal. That is why the era can be misunderstood. The reformulation was not designed to look dramatic. It was designed not to interrupt the product. If the drink still poured, still tasted acceptably consistent, still reached stores, and cost the company less to make, the substitution had done its job. And once a large manufacturer changes, the decision echoes outward. Suppliers adjust, competitors watch, equipment and contracts adapt. A processor that can sell more syrup can justify more capacity. A buyer who sees a stable supply and lower cost has another reason to use it. What began as a technical possibility turns into an industrial norm. The USDA noted that HFCS was not merely taking existing sugar uses, it also generated new uses for corn sweeteners. Total caloric sweetener availability rose from 124 pounds per person in 1975 to 79 to 130 pounds by 1986. That figure does not prove that HFCS alone caused the increase. The same USDA analysis noted other sweeteners and broader changes in the market, but it does reveal the central risk of the system. When a sweetener becomes cheaper and easier to deploy, food production can reorganize around abundance. Availability is not the same as what any one person eats. It is a measure of supply entering the food system. That distinction matters. It prevents a misleading claim that every pound supplied became a pound consumed by every person. Still, availability tells us what industry was making possible. The long arc is striking. USDA data put corn sweetener availability at 63.7 pounds per person in 1999. By then, HFCS was no longer a novel substitute. It was a familiar component of the modern American food environment, in soft drinks and other processed foods. This is where the dark history becomes personal without becoming simplistic. Most people did not choose a national agricultural policy. Most did not finance enzyme research. Most did not negotiate syrup prices, yet people encountered the results daily through products whose formulas had been optimized by institutions they would never see. The darkness was not hidden because a label concealed the letters HFCS. The ingredient was often listed. The deeper mechanism was hidden because labels do not explain why an ingredient became common. They do not show the farm program in the background, the imported sugar restricted at the border, the enzyme line running continuously in a processing plant, or the calculation that turns a fraction of a cent per serving into a national reformulation. That calculation is where industrial food power lives. It lives in the ability to change millions of products without asking millions of people. It lives in the fact that a technical improvement becomes a market shift when it is paired with the right incentives. And it lives in the way the final change can feel completely natural once enough years have passed. By the time the public began arguing about HFCS, the switch itself was old news. The system had already won the argument that mattered most. It had made the ingredient normal. There is one final twist. The public debate that came later often tried to make HFCS the whole story. That temptation is understandable. HFCS has a technical name, a corporate history, and a visible connection to processed food. It is easier to blame one ingredient than to examine an entire food system. A villain is satisfying. A system is harder to fight because it has no single face. But the evidence does not support turning HFCS into a uniquely poisonous substance. The FDA says it is not aware of evidence showing a difference in safety between HFCS 42 or HFCS 55 and other traditional sweeteners, such as sucrose and honey. The agency's advice is broader: limit added sugars. That does not erase the history, it sharpens it. The problem was never that a molecule named fructose appeared in corn syrup and changed humanity by itself. The problem was the creation of a food environment in which a sweetener could be made cheaply, supplied at scale, and incorporated into countless products because the industrial and policy systems favored that outcome. The later data show that systems can change again. USDA figures show all corn sweetener availability falling from 85.7 pounds per person in 1999 to 53.0 pounds in 2023. That is a substantial decline. It means the story is not a straight line in which HFCS permanently takes over every product. Manufacturers can reformulate again. Consumers, public scrutiny, costs, policy, and competing ingredients can all alter the next calculation. The official nutrition facts label now separately identifies added sugars, sugars added during processing, packaging, or preparation. It is not an HFCS warning label. It covers many kinds of added sugar, but it reflects a cultural change. What used to disappear into the background of a food formula is now more visible to the person holding the package. Visibility is not the same as power. A shopper can see added sugars without being able to change the farm program, the price of bulk ingredients, or the production decisions made years before the product reached the shelf. Still, visibility changes the conversation. It makes it harder to pretend that sweetness simply appears naturally and neutrally inside industrial food. The real lesson of HFCS is not fear corn syrup. It is ask what made it normal. Ask which technologies made it possible. Ask which policies made its rival more expensive. Ask which companies could change formulas at scale. Ask why those changes happened quietly, and why the public was later asked to debate the ingredient after the system around it had already been built. Return to that November day in 1984. In the court record, the transformation is reduced to a line of percentages: 50%, then 75%, then 100%. A consumer would not have seen those numbers. They would have seen the same bottle, the same logo, the same ordinary drink. That is what makes this history dark. Not because HFCS is a secret chemical monster, not because every food company or policymaker acted with the same intention, but because a chain of rational decisions can reshape a nation's food supply without ever presenting itself as a decision the nation made. An enzyme made the new syrup practical. Sugar policy made the old alternative comparatively costly. Food manufacturers made the substitution at scale, and the result entered everyday life so quietly that it eventually seemed like it had always been there. The dark history of corn syrup is the history of a system that learned how to turn corn into sweetness, sweetness into savings, and savings into normality. Once that calculation becomes ordinary, its power becomes hardest to see precisely where it lands. In the small decision to pick up a familiar bottle, unaware of the policy, processing, and contracts already inside the choice. Thank you for watching until the end. If you want more stories about the objects, systems, and hidden forces that built the modern world, subscribe to the channel. The next story is already waiting. See you in the next video.